So why am I talking about sex and gender? Today the transgender debate is something you've probably all encountered, but what do we make of it? Within my course I spent several months at the charity Teesside Positive Action, who specialise in providing education and awareness sessions on the topics of sexual health, sexuality and gender identity. And one thing I began to notice was that while people readily accepted questions around sexual orientation, gender identity always elicited more questions. And while the majority of people had an open, whatever makes you happy sort of attitude, for many people conceptual clarity was still difficult to pin down. Generally, we are told that sex concerns aspects of our biology, our genetics, our anatomy, and gender relates to sort of our experience as male and female, and the way other people view us. To put it another way, sex is what's between your legs, and gender is what's between your ears. But to me this feels insufficient, and almost suggests a sort of Cartesian dualism, where mind and body are separate entities. And it was bridging this gap that people seem to struggle with the most. I came to feel that a full discussion of the topic was being neglected, especially in regard to existing science and research. And looking here at what I consider to be elements in understanding the gender issue properly, it's no wonder it's such a difficult topic. But for me, the reason the discourse on gender is so interesting is because of how many academic boundaries it transverses. Neuroscience, biology, philosophy, patience and politics, and controversy are, to anyone who knows me well, things that I find most interesting. And one thing I want to emphasize here is controversy. Here we have 5 individuals who have, in some form or another, engaged in this debate, but have faced severe backlash. The feminist Germaine Greer, human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell, psychologist J. Michael Bailey, who was the author of The Man Who Would Be Queen, and finally the feminist and feminist critic, Julie Bindel and Milo Yiannopoulos. But I want to start with one thing I thought Germaine Greer did get right. Before we can engage in a conversation about who is a woman, we must start by defining what a woman is, or by asking what is a man and what is a woman. And while this might seem to have obvious answers, it's actually a lot more complicated. In the discourse on gender identity, I think these are the most important questions, but everyone has their own perspective. Whether you're a second-wave feminist, a neurologist, a geneticist, or a post-structuralist philosopher, you probably have a different way of answering these questions. But one crucial aspect in resolving all of these questions about what gender and what sex is understanding fully the phenomenon of gender dysphoria, the actual feeling of being at odds with one's body. This is what really defines the transgender experience, and feeling, quote, in the wrong body. Why does this happen? One option is that this is really a case of the wrong brain being in the wrong body, or that the patient has come to internalize some sort of stereotype or of idea of what a man and a woman is, and since they themselves do not conform to it, they feel at odds and don't seem like they fit in. And naturally, as in all aspects of medicine, etiology informs the course of action we should take. If you believe the former, then we should reconcile the body with the existing brain, sort of reassignment surgery, and if you believe the latter, the mind should be reconciled with the body. And in understanding the complex problems surrounding sex and gender, I kept returning to a quote from Gloria Steinem, who said, "If the shoe doesn't fit, must we change the foot?" Here, the shoe being the stereotype and notions around gender, while the foot is the individual trying to squeeze into it. Now, when asked what is a man, what is a woman, you probably would have thought of something on this list. In everyday life, we make snap assumptions about what someone's sex and gender is based on their anatomy. And in a biological context, we might think of chromosomes, hormones, testosterone, estrogen. And philosophically and psychologically, we might talk about experience of being male and female. And in most cases, these things align. I'm a man, I feel like a man, hopefully you see me as a man, and I assume, although I do not know for definite, that I have XY karyotype and that I don't possess an internal uterus. But not all people are as boring as me, and sometimes things can get a lot more complicated. So, very quickly, in most individuals, we inherit 22 chromosomes from our mum, 22 from our dad, another X from our mum, and then either an X or a Y from our dad. And on the Y chromosome that you may get from your dad, a gene called testis determining factor, and it's also known as the sex determining region on the Y chromosome. And if you possess this gene, the embryo will be diverted down the male path. And if not, a female will be born. But if only things were that simple, because in the feed-forward process between genes that go on to produce proteins that then influence the anatomy and function of our genitalia and brain, things can go alternative at every step. And in this slide, I'm drawing heavily from the work of Alex Drager, the historian of anatomy. So we have two patient cases. The first is an individual who is XY conceived. This would normally be a boy that is born. So everything proceeds as normal, and the testes pump out testosterone. But the body has no receptors with which to hear the testosterone's message. And so the body doesn't respond. And this is what's called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Here the XY individual looks, is raised, and is considered by others, and really is female. It's often not until puberty, when breasts start to develop, but they fail to get their period, that actually somebody says something's up here, doctors will do some investigations, and they will reveal internal testes and a Y chromosome. In the second case, we have a person who is XX, born and raised as a boy, who has had a girlfriend, the pair were having a normal sexual relation, but suddenly strange symptoms start to develop, and tests reveal that this was due to internal menstruation, and he had an internal uterus and fallopian tubes. How did that happen? In this case, we have a form of congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And here in utero, the adrenal glands were so active, they were pumping out so much testosterone, and consequently the genitals and the brain were masculinized. And there's a variety of other conditions that make pinning someone's sex and gender down a very complicated process. Alex Drager has said, rather than sex being a spectrum, and some people sort of lie in the middle, people can be all over the place. And in the Dominican Republic, there's a very famous case of a rare gene mutation where XY individuals are born as girls, reach puberty, the androgen levels spike, and then they spontaneously become normal men. But that's more sort of concerned with intersex conditions. What about transgender? Well, I wanted to seize on the wrong brain and the wrong body hypothesis and investigate how much evidence there was for this view. So as part of my research SSC assignment, I went looking for the research into the potential biological factors that could be causing a transgender identity. And I looked at brain studies and genetic and hormonal studies. So these were two regions of the brain, the BSTC and the INR3 and 4. These were two brain regions that were studied over the course of several years. These regions were considered to be sexually dimorphic, that's innately different in men and women. And they looked at male controls, female controls, and male-to-female transsexual people. They were selected for investigation due to the belief it was unlikely to be affected by later hormonal treatment that most people do receive, and because it diverged very early in life, which means that it was unlikely to be affected by socialization or upbringing of the children. The interesting finding was that the female transsexuals showed a BSTC and INR3 volumes and neuronal population that were more similar to the control females, they identify as females, than the control males, which was their karyotype. But 2 years later, the researchers faced a problem, and that was that these areas were actually diverging a lot later in life, so the research became a lot more questioned, and the team sort of, well, it was just a methodological flaw that they never really resolved. And then there was, a couple of years later, using MRI, a different team set out to study grey matter volumes throughout the whole of the brain. And, sorry, I might run over it just a tiny bit. And this region, once again, was more similar to control females than control males. But outside this, things were pretty similar among all of the groups. Finally, the genetic research. So they tested these 6 genes to see in control females and male-to-female transsexual people to see if there was any genes that were maybe higher in population in the transsexuals than in the control groups. And the reason they did this was so that they could select a candidate gene for further investigation. And while early research indicated that maybe there was a higher variation in these genes, later research with larger sample sizes seemed to refute this. So where does this leave the scientific community and its opinion on the transgender identity and its causes? In short, it's early days. In a review of 2010, a big research team, what do you call it, a systematic review, said that there wasn't much research for a genetic link. They feel as if the research for a neuroanatomical correlate of general gender identity was strong, but instead they pointed to emergent research on the prenatal androgens, handedness, like which hand you write with. That's really sort of, it's a bizarre phenomenon that's not known why, and transgender people tend to be more left-handed. This is something that's been noticed. And also familial correlates. You're much more likely to have somebody who has some sort of gender variant identity in your family, and they also didn't rule out the possibility of psychosocial causes. Those are just my references. So I've asked a lot of questions, and in some way I hope I've answered them, or at least shown you the complexity in answering them. I think that sex and gender are sometimes useful concepts in the beginning of this discussion, but we really need to start to look at the whole picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Will you hang on there for any questions, please? Any questions for Marcus? So yes, at the front.
Yeah, me again, sorry. But how do I put this? Without jumping, you probably know a lot more than me, but it seems as if reassignment surgery, for want of a better word, appears to be a fairly new, based on the length of human beings have been around on this planet, a fairly new phenomenon. Given that, do you think that the fact that this now exists means that transgender people are sort of come out the woodwork more now that they're able to do this? I.e., do you think that there's actually more transgender people in the world now than there were before, or they're simply more able to come out because these sorts of surgeries exist and it's become more of an open topic?
Well, I have no data on that. I haven't researched sort of whether people, whether there's more today than there was in the past. It could be that there are, it could be just that people are more open about sort of expressing themselves. And the thing to remember is that in people with transgender identity disorder, there is a lot of suicide. Possibly in the past, these people were struggling in silence. So yeah, but I wouldn't know for the exact numbers.
And at the front here.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, what course are you doing?
I'm doing medicine, so it's sort of
Okay.
patients. I think that was an answer. Sorry.
It's the right answer.
Do you think it's helpful to consider lots of intersex conditions
I think it is because
as conditions to be like investigated as diseases?
well, the sort of more and more in the literature, they're starting to regard these as more similar than they once were. There's a lot of people who want to sort of split and say transgender is one thing and intersex conditions are another, but Alex Drager, people like her, are almost starting to see transgender identity as a more complicated version of an intersex condition, where sort of you're getting brains that are different from bodies, and people sort of just not converging, their identity being sort of all over the place in one sense of the word.
Any more questions, anyone? In that case, thank you very much.